Welcome to the podcast. It's going to be Flannery O'Connor Day, and yes, I'm not in the usual spot. And yeah, I cut my hair. I mean, what are you going to do about it? I recently watched a video where Ken was saying something about how the personality is it's kind of a trap, because people they get you boxed in, and then they expect you to just keep being this same thing. That's part of the reason I was throwing in the video shorts recently too, where it's like, go watch. I decide I'm gonna make some movie of a poem. It's gonna take 90 seconds. It's a little different than these episodes. Or maybe I'm going to cut my hair because it's summer, and the more you can do these kinds of things and keep the audience off balance, the more freedom you have ultimately. Because if you're Mr. Consistency all the time, then people are going to hold you to it. But, so I've been thinking about Flannery in particular. By the way, this is the first episode we've done dedicated to a female writer. So don't let anybody ever tell you this channel isn't progressive. I do love Flannery, though. Flannery, I mean, I don't know. Do I need to do the biographical stuff? Like, she died of lupus when she was 39 years old. She was very Catholic, and I think that shaped her sensibility very much. She was Catholic in the South, which makes her probably a little bit of a weirdo. Although she grew up in Savannah, I think, which is not where it's not as uncommon. And she was into peacocks, and she walked around with crutches for the last 5-10 years of her life or whatever. And one of the things she's kind of notorious for is for thinking about violence. And so I picked a story that involves that. The story that I want us to talk about is actually not even a story. It's a fragment from a novel that was going to be her third novel, titled Why Do the Heathen Rage? That, of course, comes from the beginning of chapter 2 of the book of Psalms, and I think verse 1. Or that title, I'm saying. But what I'm really thinking about with Flannery is a couple of things. One in particular. The first one is to think about endings. And I think endings are really interesting to think about. The first thing I want to do for you here is play a little clip, if I can find it, just a little clip from a piano trio by Shostakovich that always struck me as just a perfect example of the kind of question of tone, I guess, that I'm interested in here with this episode. So, actually, first, before I play that, just a 15-second clip of Bach here to cleanse your palate. Ready? Go. Okay, so Bach. We all know Bach. We love Bach. If I could find it, that was Cello Suite Number 1 or something like that. Very what should we call it? I don't see, and the thing is, I'm not trained in music, so I don't know. It seems on key and normal to me, normal in the best way, right? This is yes. This is why people play Bach at their wedding and for study music and so on. Now listen to this little clip from a Shostakovich piece. Ready? And that is different, isn't it? It'd be a very rare person who would play that at their wedding. And it's probably maybe not the best for studying, because it's, I don't know, disharmonic, or what's the word? They call that discordant or something like that. The tones are all interesting and weird and kind of not what you expect. I asked a guy who was into music one time, why do I like this part of this weird song? And he said, oh, that's the part in that song, in that very, what was the word, discordant or whatever song, where for a moment it comes into focus for a moment. For a moment it returns to something like Bach, and you like that moment, that return to like, something you can snap your fingers to. So this thing about tone and about being like out of key or in key or whatever, if I can find it, I might even put in a clip here from Gillian Welch's guitarist that I've maybe played before that I think is interesting. And anyway, so when it comes to Flannery, and like I'm going to talk about this story in a minute, but first I am going to give you an opportunity here to take 11 minutes of your life and listen to this interesting story. Now, I'm just going to warn you, the first about 4 or 5 minutes are probably, it's a little unclear what's going on, and the reason for that is, again, this was to be an excerpt from a novel. So you have to imagine you're just kind of reading chapter 15 or something. So some of the details are kind of fuzzy. But it comes into focus as you listen to this story. The main character is this Walter Tillman guy, the son of the old man who just had a stroke and is kind of half blind now or whatever. And this guy Tillman, Walter Tillman, is presented sort of through the eye of his mother, who wants him to kind of get his act together, become an active, like proactive, positive person, basically grow up and be the man of the family now that dad is on the way out. Okay, so here you go. Ready? Listen to the Flannery O'Connor story, Why Do the Heathen Rage? Why Do the Heathen Rage? By Flannery O'Connor. Tillman had had his stroke in the state capital, where he had gone on business, and he had stayed 2 weeks in the hospital there. He did not remember his arrival home by ambulance, but his wife did. She had sat for 2 hours on the jump seat at his feet, gazing fixedly at his face. Only his left eye, twisted inward, seemed to harbor his former personality. It burned with rage. The rest of his face was prepared for death. Justice was grim, and she took satisfaction in it when she found it. It might take just this ruin to wake Walter up. By accident, both children were at home when they arrived. Mary Maud was driving in from school, not realizing that the ambulance was behind her. She got out, a large woman of 30 with a round childish face and a pile of carrot-colored hair that seeped about in an invisible net on top of her head, kissed her mother, glanced at Tillman and gasped. Then, grim-faced but flustered, marched behind the rear attendant, giving him high-pitched instructions on how to get the stretcher around the curve of the front steps, exactly like a schoolteacher, her mother thought. Schoolteacher all over. As the forward attendant reached the porch, Mary Maud said sharply in a voice used to control children, "Get up, Walter, and open the door." Walter was sitting on the edge of his chair, absorbed in the proceedings, his finger folded in the book he had been reading before the ambulance came. He got up and held open the screen door, and while the attendants carried the stretcher across the porch, he gazed, obviously fascinated, at his father's face. "Glad to see you back, Captain," he said, and raised his hand in a sloppy salute. Tillman's enraged left eye appeared to include him in its vision, but he gave him no sign of recognition. Roosevelt, who from now on would be nurse instead of yardman, stood inside the door waiting. He had put on the white coat that he was supposed to wear for occasions. He peered forward at what was on the stretcher. The bloodshot veins in his eyes swelled. Then, all at once, tears glazed them and glistened on his black cheeks like sweat. Tillman made a weak, rough motion with his good arm. It was the only gesture of affection he had given any of them. The Negro followed the stretcher to the back bedroom, snuffling as if someone had hit him. Mary Maud went in to direct the stretcher-bearers. Walter and his mother remained on the porch. "Close the door," she said. "You're letting flies in." She had been watching him all along, searching for some sign in his big, bland face that some sense of urgency had touched him, some sense that now he had to take hold, that now he had to do something, anything. She would have been glad to see him make a mistake, even make a mess of things, if it meant that he was doing something. But she saw that nothing had happened. His eyes were on her, glittering just slightly behind his glasses. He had taken in every detail of Tillman's face. He had registered Roosevelt's tears, Mary Maud's confusion, and now he was studying her to see how she was taking it. She yanked her hat straight, seeing by his eyes that it had slipped toward the back of her head. "You ought to wear it that way," he said. "It makes you look sort of relaxed by mistake." She made her face hard as she could make it. "The responsibility is yours now," she said in a harsh, final voice. He stood there with his half-smile and said nothing. Like an absorbent lump, she thought, taking everything in, giving nothing out. She might have been looking at a stranger using the family face. He had the same non-committal lawyer's smile as her father and grandfather, set in the same heavy jaw, under the same Roman nose. He had the same eyes that were neither blue nor green nor gray. His skull would soon be bald like theirs. Her face became even harder. "You'll have to take over and manage this place," she said, and folded her arms, "if you want to stay here." The smile left him. He looked at her once hard, his expression empty, and then beyond her out across the meadow, beyond the 4 oaks and the black distant tree line, into the vacant afternoon sky. "I thought it was home," he said, "but it don't do to presume." Her heart constricted. She had an instant's revelation that he was homeless here and homeless anywhere. "Of course it's home," she said, "but somebody has to take over. Somebody has to make these Negroes work." "I can't make Negroes work," he muttered. "That's about the last thing I'm capable of." "I'll tell you everything to do," she said. "Ha!" he said. "That you would." He looked at her, and his half-smile returned. "Lady," he said, "you're coming into your own. You were born to take over. If the old man had had his stroke 10 years ago, we'd all be better off. You could have run a wagon train through the Badlands. You could stop a mob. You're the last of the 19th century. You're—" "Walter," she said, "you're a man. I'm only a woman." "A woman of your generation," Walter said, "is better than a man of mine." Her mouth drew into a tight line of outrage, and her head trembled almost imperceptibly. "I would be ashamed to say it," she whispered. Walter dropped into the chair he had been sitting in and opened his book. A sluggish-looking flush settled on his face. "The only virtue of my generation," he said, "is that it ain't ashamed to tell the truth about itself." He was already reading. Her interview was at an end. She remained standing there, rigid, her eyes on him in stunned disgust. Her son, her only son. His eyes and his skull and his smile belonged to the family face, but underneath them was a different kind of man from any she had ever known. There was no innocence in him, no rectitude, no conviction either of sin or election. The man she saw courted good and evil impartially and saw so many sides on every question that he could not move, he could not work, he could not even make niggers work. Any evil could enter that vacuum. God knows, she thought and caught her breath, God knows what he might do. He had not done anything. He was 28 now, and, so far as she could see, nothing occupied him but trivia. He had the air of a person who is waiting for some big event and can't start any work because it would only be interrupted. Since he was always idle, she had thought that perhaps he wanted to be an artist or a philosopher or something, but this was not the case. He did not want to write anything with a name. He amused himself writing letters to people he did not know and to the newspapers. Under different names and using different personalities, he wrote to strangers. It was a peculiar, small, contemptible vice. Her father and her grandfather had been moral men, but they would have scorned small vices more than great ones. They knew who they were and what they owed to themselves. It was impossible to tell what Walter knew or what his views were on anything. He read books that had nothing to do with anything that mattered now. Often she came behind him and found some strange underlined passage in a book he had left lying somewhere, and she would puzzle over it for days. One passage she found in a book he had left lying on the upstairs bathroom floor stayed with her ominously. "Love should be full of anger," it began, and she thought, well, mine is. She was furious all the time. It went on. "Since you have already spurned my request, perhaps you will listen to admonishment. What business have you in your father's house? Oh, you effeminate soldier! Where are your ramparts and trenches? Where is the winter spent at the front lines? Listen! The battle trumpet blares from heaven, and see how our general marches fully armed, coming amid the clouds to conquer the whole world. Out of the mouth of our king emerges a double-edged sword that cuts down everything in the way, arising finally from your nap. Do you come to the battlefield, abandon the shade and seek the sun." She turned back in the book to see what she was reading. It was a letter from a Saint Jerome to a Heliodorus, scolding him for having abandoned the desert. A footnote said that Heliodorus was one of the famous group that had centered around Jerome at Aquileia in 370. He had accompanied Jerome to the Near East with the intention of cultivating a hermitic life. They had separated when Heliodorus continued on to Jerusalem. Eventually he returned to Italy, and in later years he became a distinguished churchman as the Bishop of Altinum. This was the kind of thing he read, something that made no sense for now. Then it came to her, with an unpleasant little jolt, that the general with the sword in his mouth, marching to do violence, was Jesus. Ooh, yeah, you did it. You listened to the end. So, okay, the end of that story is really something, isn't it? I mean, first of all, I'm just going to assume that you watched. I mean, the rest of my video won't make terribly much sense if you didn't listen to that 11-minute clip. And so, like, now let's talk about it. I guess for me, I think the first thing to notice is obviously the ending. The ending is really interesting. I'm going to talk about the ending in terms of the tone in just a second. But first, let's talk about something. I think, I'm not sure if this is exactly like literary irony or what the proper term is here, but it's like, do you notice that when you're reading at the end, you're kind of reading with, I think this is called focalized perspective. You're kind of reading through the perspective of the mother. And the mother has discovered this book that, you know, the son owns, and he just spends all his time reading and sitting around and kind of being useless. But in the book, she finds in the bathroom this underlined section, and it's the section from Jerome in that letter to Heliodorus. But like, as you're reading it, you're like, basically, I mean, I assume, and like none of you would know this letter in, you know, from the back of your mind, right? So you're reading in the same way his mother is, like with this curiosity. What is it? What is going on in this passage that he has underlined, that my, you know, useless, loafing around son has underlined? And it turns out that, at least in my judgment, it's a really interesting bit of text to have underlined, right? Because what is it? She kind of has to read it twice. She says, it says near the end, like, actually, let me pull it up. She says, like, it it dawned on me or something, like it occurred to me only finally. What does she say there? Then it came to her. Then it came to her with an unpleasant little jolt. Now, see, that's the thing. This is the thing, is like you could just read this without, you could just read this like you're the mother. But what I'm saying is, like, don't be the mother so fast. Hold on. Don't share her judgment necessarily, okay? I think there's the space in this story for a layer of ambiguity that the mother is not perceiving. So, like, whereas for her, it's self-evidently bad that this guy just sits around, that he doesn't become his father, you know, that, like, he's a loafer, as I said, okay? But it's not clear to me that from Flannery's perspective, it's quite as bad. Now, it may still be bad. It may be somehow morally impeachable. This may be like less than, you know, the perfected saintly behavior or something. But knowing what we know about Flannery especially, that her Catholic faith was so important to her, and that, like, okay. The quote from Jerome that the son was reading and that he underlined begins, "Love should be full of anger." Now, the first time you heard that or read it, you don't know what the source is. So it's kind of like, love should be full of anger. I mean, is this like Emile Choron or Nietzsche? Like, what am I reading? It seems very modern. It seems very like, very like, what's that word? Like rebellious, or like just like contrarian is kind of the word I'm looking for, right? Okay, so love should be full of anger, and then it went on. Since you, now you, we don't know what we're reading, but it's like someone's being addressed in this letter and admonished, right? Since you have already spurned my request, perhaps you will listen to admonishment. Okay, well, we don't know who's speaking, and that's the whole point. Who's speaking here? Whose voice is this the first time you live? And then he says, "What business have you in your father's house, O you effeminate soldier?" And now it's like, oh, wait. Okay, the father's house, to me, even the first time I read this, sounded like that's a New Testament or even Old Testament sounding phrase, right? I think we're talking about God here now. But then to say, like, you effeminate soldier, like, who's being addressed? So this is a general, or like I don't know, whatever's right under a general, a lieutenant or something, talking to another soldier. Oh, you effeminate soldier, like reproaching him. Where are your ramparts and trenches? Where is the winter spent on the front lines? Listen, the battle trumpet blares from heaven, and see how our general marches fully armed, coming amid the clouds to conquer the whole world. Now it's like, oh, okay. And by the way, in the text, general is capitalized. Out of the mouth of our king emerges a double-edged sword. Now, unless that's an accident, that's a clear reference to the book of Revelation, the two-edged sword that John the Revelator mentions, and so on. So this is Jesus. But it takes the mother a minute to realize, right? So when she does, she reads this footnote that it's from a letter from Saint Jerome sent to Heliodorus, and it says Heliodorus was one of the famous group that had centered around Jerome at Aquileia in 370, and he had accompanied Jerome to the Near East and all this stuff. Well, so she finally realizes, like only at the end, that the general coming with the sword in his mouth, marching to do violence, was Jesus. And then it ends. And now, like, we don't know exactly. We don't know, this doesn't have to be the end of the novel that she was writing, right? This is just the end of, like, this scene. But I love it because it ends on, like, an ambiguous note. It's like, where should my judgment be? And it's not given to us. And I know that, like, not everybody loves this. I mean, I've said before, like, I love that movie called Doubt. Do you know that movie, Doubt? with Philip Seymour Hoffman, and I love it because it ends like without resolving the central mystery of the movie. And that movie is this movie that sets up this ambiguous question of whether the priest is like a child abuser or not. And of course, if he is, that's very bad. But if he isn't, and he's being falsely accused, then that's also very bad. And so, like, as the viewer, you want it resolved, right? Like, you want it to come to an end. But then what you're just sort of not given that end. No catharsis comes. If I can find, I just watched, by the way, the other day, and this is another reason I wanted to talk Flannery. I just watched American Psycho for the first time, a 2000 movie based on the Bret Easton Ellis novel that I haven't read, but now I want to read it. And at the end of the movie, there's this scene. I'll try to plug it in if I can, although I'm worried about copyright stuff or whatever. But there's a moment where it's right after he goes complete, like, manic episode, just starts shooting everybody or whatever.
I want my pain to be inflicted on others. I want no one to escape. But even after admitting this, there is no catharsis. My punishment continues to elude me, and I gain no deeper knowledge of myself. No new knowledge can be extracted from my telling. This confession has meant nothing.
And he says something like, there's some line in there about no catharsis coming, and it's very interesting because, like, on the one hand, like, from his perspective, yeah, that's what, when I'm watching it, I'm just cringing because it's like, dude, well, once you start shooting everybody, this is stupid. Like, how is this supposed to end? You know what I mean? It's like, my wife is a creative writer, and she used to sometimes teach undergrads about creative writing, and one of the things she would always point out is when you if you're going to teach, like, college freshmen or sophomores creative writing, then you have to expect that, like, half of the short stories they turn in will end with some dramatic suicide or murder. And it's like, this is too over the top. It's just not good. It's never good, And it's very difficult to write, especially as the ending of your story, a scene like that. Because it's just like, oh, wow, like, it's so over the top, and it's just like, it's got no tact. There's no nuance. There's no, like, delicacy. And there's no ambiguity at the end of it. But I thought this movie was pretty good, the American Psycho movie, because at the end of the movie, although there's no catharsis for him, in the sense that, like, I can't even remember, for him, he, like, gets away with it, but then it's like, did he even do it? And apparently there's a bunch of theories about what's even going on at the end of this movie. Is he hallucinating? Does he have a split personality? Whatever. But interestingly, like, for the viewer, I don't think certainty is necessary in order to give us, the viewer, a kind of catharsis. Somehow, for me, in fact, sometimes I feel like I get catharsis out of an ambiguous ending. And I think that, like, in this short story by Flannery, it's like, that's part of what I'm getting, right? Like, first of all, there's the suggestion of a warlike Christianity, a kind of Christianity that is prepared to do violence to defend itself, right? And thinking in terms of, like, warlike rhetoric, calling Jesus the general, talking about the sword, the double-edged sword that cuts both ways, that's on his tongue or whatever, and how he's coming to do violence. I mean, again, these are the kinds of talking points that just are omitted or neglected in most Sunday school classes, and even, of course, in most, Christian church sermons nowadays. But, like, they are there historically, and I think it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking through. Now, of course, if you are going to think through it, it's like, it is the Holy Roman Catholic Church that has tended to be more proactive in that direction. And so sometimes it gets criticized as being, too much like an empire or something from, I guess, like, anti-Catholic people. But Flannery's Catholic, and for her, this idea of Jesus, as the commander-in-chief is not too foreign. All right, a couple of other things about this story. I mean, like, one of the the first things that strike, like when you read the first 4 pages, if you had a hard time listening to the first like 4 minutes of my 11-minute short story reading, probably part of what you're struggling with is that this is not an obvious parable or like an allegory. It's not clear exactly. Like, for example, the old man, we're told, has suffered some sort of a stroke or whatever, and now he can't see, or he's like basically paralyzed, but his one left eye appears to have like energy left in it still. And it's like, okay, well, what is that? Like, is that symbolic of anything? Or like, what should I make of it? You know what I mean? Like, if we're reading a short story by Hawthorne called The Birthmark, well, then like the birthmark in the story is obviously a symbol of, I don't know, like original sin or whatever. You have to interpret all those things. But it's true sometimes in the 20th century, in particular, like with Flannery and with lots of these writers, that you're going to get like realist details. That is to say, details that sort of just saturate your sensory imagination. You know, in other words, like she just wants you to be there with them on the farm in Georgia or wherever this story is set, and like and so like the old man's condition, or like something like the son's sloppy. He gives him like apparently like a sarcastic salute when the dad comes home on the stretcher, and it's like, okay, that doesn't necessarily have to be a symbol. It could just be that it establishes the tone of the relationship between the father and the son. And that's the kind of thing that, like, in real life, you know, is the stuff of relationships, right? It's not always, like, neat. It's not, like, a lot of times I've been watching shows with my 7-year-old daughter in particular right now that are probably too advanced for her. I mean, whatever. It's just I'm a person who doesn't, like, swear words don't bother me that much. So if we're watching a PG-13 movie, as long as there's not, like, you know, like gross sex stuff or something, my kid can watch it. So we're watching I can't remember what it was the other day. And she said something like, is this the bad guy? Because, you know, the 7-year-old mind kind of searches that out. But, like, I had to try to explain to her, well, I mean, maybe there's not a bad guy, good guy thing going on here. These are just people kind of interacting. And I think the same is probably true in Flannery's, at least in this short story, right? So the situation you've got here is, like, you've got the dad who's become, like, somewhat impotent, right? Or he's, like, aged out of his patriarchal role now. But then that, like, you could interpret that as is that a symbol of, like, I don't know, like, you know, like liberal, progressive, historical progress or something like that, or the church becoming adamant and outmoded or something like that. I mean, all these things are kind of potential in that image. And of course, the mother says, like, you know, to the son, you'll have to take over, you'll have to manage this place if you want to stay here, right? But then, like, notice what the son does. He kind of abdicates. He sort of isn't inclined to, like, step into the role of patriarch here. And they even have this thing where, you know, she's like, well, somebody's got to make the Negroes work. And he's like, I can't do that. Now, why can't he? Like, is he a new man? He doesn't do that or something? And it's not exactly clear here, right? By the way, I mean, you can read endless papers about Flannery's, like, racial insensitivity. I mean, like, when James Baldwin came down to meet her, she wouldn't meet him in Georgia. There's a lot to say about it. I mean, I don't know. Like, basically, she was just an old-fashioned Southern racist. I kind of just leave it to the side when reading her stories. But there's this moment where, you know, the mother kind of says to him, like, you got to do it. You got to step up. And she says, I'll tell you what to tell them, the servants, tell them what to do. And he says, like, he laughs at that. Ha, you would, lady, you know, you're coming into your own. You were born to take over, he says to his mother. And she's like, well, you know, you're the man. I'm only a woman. Like, so she has this kind of traditional attitude, and then he, you know, again, he eschews responsibility. A woman of your generation is better than a man of mine, and she's ashamed to say it, she says, and so on. So, and then he says, the only virtue of my generation is that we tell the truth, which is kind of interesting. It reminds, I mean, that's my feeling about, like, kind of the Gen X attitude, which is like, yeah, we're not going to do anything responsible. You know, we're going to wear grungy clothes and tell you the truth about how perverse everything has become and just wait for it to burn. And it seems that's his attitude here. But of course, the mother thinks of this as like laziness, as like irresponsibility, and she says that like, you know, any evil could enter the vacuum that is in him. He apparently, you know, won't take a stand on anything. She says it was impossible to tell what Walter knew or what his views were on anything. He read books that had nothing to do with anything that mattered now. I mean, I find that to be a fascinating, dull critique. Like, I can't, it's like, maybe it's like midwit IQ stuff or something to be like, oh, you're wasting your time reading Aeschylus when you could be, like, I don't know, like doing something else. It's like, yeah, I am actually. So I guess so. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this story. Again, like, what do we make of it? I mean, for me, the moral question of the story is like, you know, is this guy, Walter, whatever his name is, Walter Tillman, is he like a, you know, like an irresponsible Gen X man boy who never grew up? Or like, is there like a level of depth there? I mean, remember, notice it says that he notices everything. Nothing escapes him, right? So he does see the way the dad looked at him, the way the mother looked at the dad, and so on. He's perceiving everything. She just doesn't like his reaction. It's like she wants him to put on his dad's costume and kind of become his dad. And he's like, not so fast, right? I'm just going to keep taking it in. And essentially, like, he kind of does nothing here, which is an interesting sort of a reaction. And maybe it's kind of gothic. Maybe it's kind of, you know, fatalist or like pessimistic. Maybe it is kind of nihilistic or skeptical. But maybe, you know, he's sitting there in the bathroom reading letters from St. Jerome to Heliodorus about Christ the King. Maybe he has another layer of understanding about how that second coming, how the kingdom of Christ comes to the world. I mean, I'm reminded of this poem, the end of this poem that I always return to by Milton. By the way, I'm, you know, this far into my Paradise Lost. But the Milton poem, it's called On His Blindness. I think it's a sonnet, and it ends with those lines that's like, they also serve who only stand and wait. And that's but actually it really connects to that idea that I was talking about with Meister Eckhart, that like, this idea that you're going to like will your way into paradise. No, that's not how God works. Like, you don't have to do anything, really. In some sense, you might let God work in you, but like even that's overstating how much you are participating in it. Like, at some level, you kind of just pray, maybe, and do your thing, and hope that sort of through that, God enters history, like enters the world. And it seems possible to me that that's what Walter Tillman is doing here. And so it's possible to me that although the mom's judgment of him is negative, Flannery's judgment, or like our judgment, more importantly, God's judgment of him, might be that he's a saint in the end. So something like that. Okay, that's pretty much it for this episode. I really strongly encourage people to read Flannery in the same way I did Jorge Luis Borges. I mean, the stories are all 5-7 pages long. And again, what I love about them is so often they end on that Shostakovichian atonal note of ambiguity where it's like, what just happened here? And oftentimes it sort of seems to demand a second read, which is fun with a short story because you can just kind of flip back a couple pages and see if you missed any details. It's basically great brain food. And I don't know, like, I do sort of trust that O'Connor really was serious about God and truth and morality. And so we could probably benefit from listening to her. She does have 2 novels. Maybe I'll come back. If I was going to do an episode on one of them, it would be her first, which is called Wise Blood. It's a awesomely weird novel. One of the weirdest novels that I've ever read. But pretty good, but maybe difficult to summarize in an episode. Anyway, that's the Flannery O'Connor episode. I'll probably take a few days off now. Happy Easter if I don't hear from you between now and then. He is risen. And then we'll probably do Paradise Lost when I come back from Easter break. Bye-bye!